Instead, she replied, "What's real about a name?" Only a few knew Candy Darling's birth name during her lifetime. Most were either indifferent or too polite to ask. After all, she was part of a milieu where so many creative people, from Ultraviolet to Jackie Curtis, reinvented themselves behind new names. But once upon a time, there had been a child named James Lawrence Slattery. Candy's good friend Jeremiah Newton was one of those who knew that name. Jeremiah explained that while she'd never denied she'd once been Jimmy, Candy always spoke of him in the third person. Jimmy used to, instead of I used to. She'd broken with that identity. So calling her anything but Candy, once she'd chosen that name, would have been rude and disrespectful, even back in the 1960s and 70s. The terms dead naming and misgendering did not exist during Candy's lifetime, nor did the words transgender and non-binary. Homosexuality was illegal, so was cross-dressing. Candy predates many of the conversations about gender going on now. She began her life as a tortured, effeminate boy because she wasn't really a boy. She was always she, and I will be using she, her pronouns for her throughout. But the name? An evolving trans movement hasn't reached consensus about whether to even acknowledge the old name. Some trans people say, "The life I lived as a gender that didn't feel right under a name that wasn't appropriate is part of my story and my struggle, and don't erase my history." Others say, "The name I chose is my name for the duration of my life, and to call me by the name and the gender assigned to me at birth invalidates my identity, and that feels like an assault." As a biographer, I've had to ask myself whether I can really use the name that Candy hadn't yet chosen when discussing her childhood. Isn't it misleading? Isn't it false? What made sense to me in the end was to consider what Candy would have wanted. Her disconnection from her birth name and her statement that it doesn't matter who we were, only who we are. These are imperatives I have to honor, so I am calling her Candy. However, her family and childhood friends spoke of her as Jimmy and son and brother and he, him. To change their words is to deny the context that surrounded her. The disorienting childhood she had to negotiate while living in a homophobic, transphobic world with a boy's name and boy's body. I have not sanitized that context. The two different names applied here during the chapters about her childhood illustrate the friction between who she really was and how she was perceived. And of course, what's real about a name? This is the story of becoming Candy. The word trans implies a journey. 1. You sure you're not a girl? She was the beauty queen who didn't belong and never had, never would. By the end of her life, Candy Darling had succeeded in becoming the toast of a certain kind of town. More precisely, the toast of a certain part of a certain kind of town. And that had never included Massapequa Park, Long Island, her hometown. There, she always tried to obey her mother's wish, "Don't let anyone see you." Candy usually stayed with friends in Manhattan or Brooklyn. She never had her own apartment, but even when she was able to move in with a friend for months at a time, her mother's house at 79 First Avenue in Massapequa Park remained home base throughout her short life. She had to arrive and depart under cover of darkness. She could not answer the door or walk in the yard. Blinds were drawn. And when the taxi came to drive her to the Long Island Railroad, she ran for it. The Slatterys had arrived in Massapequa Park in 1957, as Candy was about to enter 7th grade. She turned 13 that November. The only living witness to the years before that was Candy's half-brother Warren, who agreed to answer questions by email if I did not publish his last name. Candy and Warren had different fathers. In my one brief phone conversation with Warren, he spoke of not wanting his friends to know about Candy. In his emails, he skipped over many of my queries, explaining, "A lot of the answers to your questions after 65...